The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Luke. Jesus said, I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies, do good and lend. Expect nothing in return. For your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. For he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Today, I am going to put together a little Paul and Luke for you. Luke does as much himself when he talks about Paul a lot in the Acts of the Apostles, though it's not always clear that the Paul that Luke presents is the Paul that was really Paul. So I just offer that up as something to begin to think about as we go through this. And I'll start with Luke. So I just want you to know, Luke speaks into a context that we, I think in the United States of America, probably have a hard time understanding, but should become more familiar with. In the first century of the Roman Empire, there was a social structure of things called patronage. And anybody had to have a patron all the way up to the emperor. And it worked that way. If you wanted to make something out of your life, you had a patron and you were a supplicant and you would go ask for help and things, and it was how things worked. And it was really especially good if it worked if you didn't fully pay back your patron. Your patron always wanted you to be in debt in some way so that you would always have something to give. Now, we have modern examples of patronage culture. It worked all the time. If any of you love to watch, all of those mob movies, those movies are about patronage culture, right? You walk up and the boss is the one you owe your ultimate patronage to. But there are whole societies where this is still the case. We live in a society, and we, especially here at St. Francis, I think, believe in the sense of agency for each individual, that we can make of ourselves something more. Now, that doesn't exclude relationship and community. That's all important, and that's part of what we do here at St. Francis is build community around helping people understand their own agency and welcoming it. That's what diversity in our communities of thought, of culture, and everything else is all about. It's not all that it's about, but it is about those things. And Jesus gives us a program to live that out. So when we get into this reading from Luke and we see things like, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. These are issues around our own willingness to do the things of God because we have been called by God to do them and we choose to work with God in this way. It's a whole program of how to live life in the kingdom here and now, and it's important that we not forget that. But I will also tell you a couple of things. One is, most of you know a little bit about my personal story. My father was Roman Catholic, my mother was Methodist. The biggest influences on my early Christian life were from my grandparents of my mother, and they were of the evangelical leaning fundamentalist side of the Methodist Church, which is a very narrow place in the Methodist Church now, but it was not that narrow back then. And I can remember going to church services with my grandparents in Florida in July, back when they didn't have air conditioning in those church buildings. They had fans. I know, when we would get ready to go to see and my grandparents didn't have air conditioning in their home either, and they never did. It was interesting. Whenever we got ready to go on these vacations, my older sisters would get really upset because we didn't have air conditioning. We were from Virginia. We had air conditioning. We were very modern. And after a while, you would get used to these things. But I would be sitting in those pews in that Methodist church, sometimes on always on Sunday morning, and sometimes on Wednesday nights. You had to go to church at least twice a week with my grandparents, just saying. And listening to the preachers, and back then, even though it wasn't the primary theology of the Methodist Church, fire and brimstone was certainly not out of bounds. And so the ultimate meaning of life was some of the things that you had to deal with. So even if you're doing these things, how do you know, and what would the ultimate part of life be like? That place where after you die. And I'm sorry, folks. I'm sort of like, Harry and Harry Met Sally. I thought about and brooded when I was a young man on those sorts of things, like what will ultimately happen, and should I read the end of the book first before I die? This is what Paul is beginning to address in that Corinthian community after a whole bunch of stuff about how the community lives together. He wanted to reassure them about ultimate things. And I bring this up because I was also led to understand that ultimate things are actually an obsession with lots of human beings. So I've been listening to some lectures on Thomas Jefferson. And yes, I understand in today's world, Thomas Jefferson's more complicated. He was always complicated, I would just like everybody to know. But we just sort of acknowledge the complications of Thomas Jefferson probably more realistically than we did when I was a young man growing up. In fact, I tell people, even when I was in college, I spent a number of sort of my deleterious days at UVA. They were always fun to go find women and party. Hampton-Sydney, where I went to school, was all male. And I heard a lot about Thomas Jefferson in that day and age. Oh, they were so very proud. And I'm not sure if I went to Charlottesville today or UVA that they would have the same thing. They used to call UVA TJ's school. Like, TJ, my buddy, Thomas, right? I know him as TJ. And they would extol those virtues. I even dated a young woman from UVA, and she talked about TJ school all the time. She's really proud to be there. Well, Thomas Jefferson was concerned about ultimate things, even in his own case. And it's not clear sort of what faith that Thomas Jefferson held. The best we think is probably he was some sort of deist, where God was out there somewhere and not particularly intimate. But Thomas Jefferson wanted to leave a legacy, and one of the things that he did was he created an obelisk for himself as his final monument at his death. And this obelisk had three things on it. And he was very clear about what was to be written and what was not. And it said, author of the Declaration of Independence. By the way, that's the first time he ever referred to himself as the author in that sense. Author of the Virginia Declaration of Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. Now, it's interesting when you look at people's tombstones and epitaphs, what they want to tell you about themselves. And I do think Thomas Jefferson wanted to be remembered for that inspiring document in both cases, the Religious Declaration of Freedom and the Declaration of Independence, and the person who gave a university a place of formation and knowledge back to the Commonwealth. I also think it's interesting that because we're so obsessed with ultimate things, people used to make pilgrimages to see his obelisk. There's an obelisk there now. It was a replacement obelisk. His was shorter, rough-hewn. He didn't want people, running away with the materials. The problem is we so deified Miss TJ that people used to chip off pieces of that obelisk to have something of Thomas Jefferson to take home, to the point where it finally got so tattered that the Congress of the United States built him another obelisk, which is the obelisk that is there now. And just showing how people elevate over time, the obelisk was twice as big. So there you go. But Jefferson was concerned about what his legacy would be. We, too, I think, are concerned about our legacies, and we are anxious about whether life means all of this stuff. What about the pain? What about the suffering? Will I have meaning beyond? And the truth is, I think that's a little scary. But Paul, seeing this to the Corinthians, and by the way, I will also tell you something else. There's an end of time moment that is different for Luke and different for Paul. Luke has lived on, and he begins to talk about end time things, seeing in Jesus that they sort of overlap with this time things. And even though Paul sort of does, Paul mostly focuses on that not yet part of the end time. Because Paul thought the end time was coming 2 weeks, 3 years at the outside. And here's what he says to the people. Listen, I tell you a mystery. We will not all die, but we will all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. The trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For this perishable body must put on imperishability, and this mortal body must put on immortality. When this perishable body puts on imperishability, and this mortal body puts on immortality, then the saying that is written will be fulfilled. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? This comes in the verses succeeding, Paul's talking about the first Adam and the second Adam, dust and heaven and all these other things. And I think at some level, two things are happening. First of all, Paul thought in two languages. He spoke Greek. He probably spoke a reasonably good Hebrew. And to try and translate Greek thought into Hebrew thought's challenging enough as it is. But also, he was talking two languages, the languages of the spiritual life and the language of the present life, and those make it even tougher. And so Paul is beginning to talk about dust and heaven and immortality and perishability and imperishability because it's hard to explain how our relationship with God continues when the body wears out. That's the legacy thing. Do we continue to have a relationship with God? What does it look like? How is it going to be? Doesn't death win? The answer from Paul basically is death does not win because God is stronger than death. Now that wasn't always a common thought in and among the culture. And I will tell you, even today in the 21st century, we try to avoid that thought when we start talking about life. You listen to people who never go to church, who are both not religious and not particularly spiritual either, and they sort of assume a spirituality and a thing that goes on, and it's like, really? Have you faced the conclusions of your basic life assumptions? Paul is putting that to the Corinthians and trying to reassure them that God, in his glory, invites us into eternal relationship. And then comes all the vocabulary and philosophical problems of trying to explain what that looks like. Because we're still bound by that perishable and mortal body, the one that's imperfect. By the way, these were my fears and anxieties when I was 15 years old sitting in that Methodist church in Jupiter, Florida. And this is still something that people worry about today. And Paul is making a reassurance about the end time of our life and the end time of God's current creation. Luke, however, does this a different way. The Jesus we meet in Luke is a Jesus who is concerned about living the kingdom here and now. I love this statement that he makes in this, that we who do this will be children of God, that we can already access this legacy life in the here and now by living out God's program here on earth. We do it not to earn our way in. We do it because it's the right thing to do for people in relationship with God. We can already begin to know that eternal, imperishable, spiritual body right now. I mean, that's one of the things that I really like to emphasize with people I engage in the life of the church today is this is the practice place for what goes beyond. That's why we gather and we start with worship and acknowledgement of God. That's why we sit together and shake hands at the passing of the peace. We share our stories in coffee hour, and we energize ourselves to turn our faces outward to begin to do this program, to love your enemies and your neighbors. And I know it's really hard to do those things, especially the people in your life that are closest to you who irritate the living daylights out of you. It's an interesting program, and it's a hard program, and it's a program that Jesus basically embeds in the community he begins to build, as we're told about in the Gospel of Luke. It's stuff that we participate in. And I think this is such an incredible piece of writing for an annual meeting. Because as I've talked about, we renew at annual meetings our commitment to all of this stuff. I mean, it's required by law, it's required by canon, but what's its real purpose? Its real purpose is to talk about us as a community of people who are God followers, lovers of Jesus, people blessed in our receiving and committed to trying to do this program. And this program is not the easiest program to live out, but it's the blessed program to live out. It's the program that glorifies God and gives credit where credit is due in those places far beyond where we're tied here. I'll remind you this week, because it's in our order of service program announcements, furnish an apartment for an Afghan family. I remember when I was asked about this, when we knew that people were going to be refugees from Afghanistan. Could we do something? This isn't organized by the vestry. This was organized by average people sitting in the pews saying, can we do this? And the answer was, yes, we can. Motivated people. That is the history and tradition of St. Francis Episcopal Church in Great Falls. We're not a big corporate-sized parish. We're the kind of parish where our relationships with one another cause us to be worried about our relationships with those around us. And this particular thing where we're furnishing an apartment, we've got the first one down. Yes! And we've got another one to come. By the way, I will also let you know if we can figure out a way to provide a used car. If anybody has one they're trying to get rid of, whatever, we have a family that can use transportation. They're going to be living in Leesburg, and as most of you know, if you're living in Leesburg, there ain't a lot in easy walking distance of where you live. We're going to figure this out, folks, but this is what we're living toward. These are not our enemies, by the way. These are the people that live alongside us. Yes, they're all out in Leesburg, and yes, they started in Afghanistan, but they're our neighbors, and that's what we do here at St. Francis. We find ways to serve our neighbors and to glorify God because it's what Jesus asked us to do. We begin to live the imperishable life when we do it. We create imperishable things, relationships, and focus and theology. Annual meetings are anxiety-producing times, and I'm sorry that I have extended my sermon a little this morning, but they're exciting times because they're the times we renew the kind of people we are. And what is great about this parish is the kind of people who are committed to one another and to the neighborhood in which we live, all the way to Afghanistan and beyond. Here's the promise. Follow the program, and you will already begin to know the imperishable life that Paul promised. It is the enduring life of relationship with God, love of God, and knowledge of each other, mediated through Jesus Christ, the man who gave his life for us and encouraged us to give our lives for the world.